Good afternoon, everyone. This is Simon Tupman, welcoming everyone to the August 2023 edition of Law Chat, which is brought to you, as it is every month, with the kind support of Moore Markhams, accountants and business advisors specializing in financial services for the legal profession. And it's my great pleasure to welcome my guest today from Auckland, Emily Morrow, who's going to be talking about succession planning and how to take a strategic approach to it. Emily, welcome to you, and thank you for joining us on Law Chat today.
My pleasure. It's really nice to be here, Simon.
That's terrific. And we've got a half an hour here to talk about a very important topic, I think, succession planning. But this is something that you have direct experience of, and very successfully too, I might add. But before we get into the whys and hows and wherefores of succession planning, I wonder if, by way of introduction, you might be able to tell us a little bit about your background. By way of introduction, I can say, I think confidently, you are a people and culture consultant specializing in professional services. You're a former managing partner of a large law firm in the USA. And now I can say we're actually colleagues in the Law X group, which is a collaboration of experts offering a range of services to law firms and legal professionals. So your background, you're now living in New Zealand, but originally from the United States.
Yes, originally from Vermont. And I became a partner at a fairly large firm in Vermont, as you mentioned, and built from scratch an estate planning and tax practice, and managed and built that practice for almost 20 years. And during probably the last 5 or 10 years of the work in that practice, I was focused on what would be the next level of leadership for that practice. And so cultivated, actually, one of the people who ended up taking over the practice was a legal executive who ended up going to law school and then coming back, and another partner in the firm. And so in 2005, I actually did a couple of things. I left the US and moved to New Zealand and left the practice. And now, 18 years later, that practice is still going strong. It's going into its third level of leadership, with my successor retiring soon, and she's cultivated someone else to take over. So we were able, through that transition, to maintain probably in excess of 95% of the client base for the firm after I left. So it was a great experience. And
that's
fantastic.
Very satisfying. And proof that succession planning, when done properly, does work.
Well, and I felt as an estate planning lawyer that it would be very disingenuous for me not to do a good job with that.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. So you took a bit of a long run up. Had you planned to come to New Zealand for some time, or did it sort of accelerate the need to find a successor?
Well, we had actually been planning for about 5 years. Excuse, my cat has decided to join us.
Yeah. This is Pearl, by the way, everyone.
This is Pearl. Yeah. She's also very knowledgeable about matters legal. But anyway, we had been planning for about 5 years to move here. And but I had been thinking about the transition well before that. And we had a team of about 10 people. And we had 3 lawyers working in the group, and then support staff. So in the end, it was a significant client base we had. So
absolutely. Yeah. So here we are. We're in a situation, and I'm looking at this from a predominantly a New Zealand or Australasian perspective, I guess. But certainly the research that I've done in this field suggests that there are many senior partners and also solo practitioners who are quite vulnerable by virtue of the fact that they don't have a succession plan in place, or they don't have any successors in place. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, I would very much agree with that. And I would say it's exacerbated by the fact that it's difficult right now to hire senior level lawyers. And I think psychologically, there's a high level of anxiety and avoidance that lawyers experience when they think about transitioning. There's anxiety about, well, will I lose my client base if I let people know that I'm thinking of moving on? And there's also kind of a feeling of no one else can do it as well as I can. So all of these get in the way of realistically looking at what's going to happen when you decide it's time no longer to practice. And it's a concern, obviously, not only just for the individual lawyer, but for the whole firm, if you're in a firm with multiple practitioners.
Absolutely. So it's not
Yeah.
just the retiree, but
Mm.
it's the people that he or she leaves behind.
It's, and that is both the people working in the firm and of course the client base. And
Absolutely.
one of the things I've found is that most what will sometimes motivate a lawyer, an older lawyer, a senior lawyer, to begin to think about this is the concern about what's going to happen to my client base when I leave.
Yeah.
Mm,
So, if for those who may be watching or tuning into this either live or watching the recording, they may be typically practice managers or general managers or
mm,
CEOs of law firms, and generally those that tune into Law Chat tend to come from firms of typically small to mid-size. But if they haven't got a succession plan, or that they've got partners who perhaps don't are avoiding the issue, they may be in their
yeah.
mid 60s, and everyone's too frightened to sort of ask Dennis the dinosaur or whomever, look, when are you going to step down? There may be no agreed age for retirement in the firm or in the partnership agreement. Perhaps there's issues around valuation that need to be discussed. How would you encourage them to start that conversation?
Yeah, yeah. It's a really good question, Simon, because typically someone in that position has a lot of responsibility, but not a lot of authority. When I say that position, I mean a practice manager or a
Yeah,
CEO or firm administrator or whatever it is. And what I have found is helpful is to add that as a topic in a strategic planning retreat. To talk about the topic in kind of a neutral, impersonal way and just get it out there. A lot of times in retreats, what I find it can be helpful to just go around the table and say, so kind of in general terms, what are everyone's plans for the next 5 to 10 years, and kind of get the kind of take the topic kind of out of the closet and just normalize it a little bit and talk about it. And then obviously the design of the succession plan is going to need to be tailored to the individual practitioner and his or her practice.
yeah.
But I don't know, what have you found to be helpful in that regard to start the conversation?
Well, I think if it's not threatening, I think
Mm,
that is one thing. And I think you're right. I think there is a fear about, what will the clients think,
mm,
because, they've been my clients for 20 or 25 years or whatever.
yeah,
But my experience suggests that the younger partners in the firm are often a little reluctant to press
yeah,
senior to come clean, as it were, in terms of, well, what are your plans?
yeah.
But it strikes me that, increasingly these days, it's for the good of all concerned, both clients and the
Mm,
successors, to have a healthy discussion.
it
Uh,
is.
and sometimes it's been reserved for a portion of the retreat rather than having an entire retreat for
Absolutely.
to
That
actually
would
talk
be
about
one
it.
of several
Yeah,
topics that
yeah,
isn't. I actually used the fact that I had an active succession plan in in the works as a business development tool in my practice. Because my clients, as I got to be a bit older, my clients began to wonder, well, what's going to happen when Emily isn't, here anymore? And I used to say to them, look, you don't need to worry about that because we are doing active succession planning. We've got very capable people lined up. And whether it's that I retire or I get hit by a Mack truck one day or whatever it is, you are well taken care of. So, I think it's normalizing the issue is
yes,
really helpful. But to do that, the lawyer, the partner, the director, whatever, needs to have a certain level of comfort and confidence around the topic so that you kind of embrace it rather than, distancing from it. And psychologically, that is kind of a different way of thinking. But my clients welcomed it. They welcomed that.
because it gives them comfort and reassurance.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And it solidified those long-term relationships, whether they were with individuals or institutional or corporate clients.
yeah.
It strengthened those relationships with the firm as an entity.
So may I ask, from your experience,
Mm,
these issues are partly to do with policy, and partly
mm,
to do with declaration, I guess, um, of any individual concerned who might be up for retirement soon.
mhm.
on that basis, do you think should be in a succession plan, should be incorporated into a partnership agreement, or is it just a
Yeah.
standalone document that encompasses the policy at the retirement age and all the rest of
Mm.
it?
Yeah. Again, good question. I guess what I've seen some firms do is that have sort of fairly generic language in the partnership agreement or the shareholders agreement around the age and so forth. And then that is fleshed out in a separate document.
Yes,
And obviously it's easier to fine tune that kind of secondary document than it is to make a change to the original partnership or shareholders agreement. And there, I think it can be kind of an iterative process where the firm learns what has worked well when certain people are leaving the practice.
yes, yes,
Yeah. So I absolutely. I mean, I think there needs to be something in writing. It needs to address the how, the what, the when, the financial aspect of things,
yes,
so that it's addressed in a way that is professional. I
yes.
mean, as lawyers, we do great professional work for our clients, and we should be doing great professional legal work and
For
financial
ourselves.
work for ourselves and our practices and for the benefit of our clients.
Absolutely.
I feel quite strongly about that one.
Yeah, yeah, no, of
Yeah,
course, and it's
yeah.
common sense in some ways, really, isn't it? But can I just ask this
Mm,
question? Normally on Law Chat, we also invite people if they've got any questions, if they want to just put them in the chat box, and we're happy to put them to Emily as they come in. But let me just pose a question here. I suspect that there are those who feel that they might have started this a little bit too late, that they may be in
mm,
their early 60s, that in the absence of a succession plan, they themselves have got to make some kind of decision or at least
yeah.
have the conversation themselves. So, for those who may have left it a little bit too late, or rather late, not necessarily too late,
Uh-huh.
what advice might you give for them?
Yeah.
Is it ever too late, or do you
No, I
think?
would say the starting point is it's never too late. It's never too late. And if you have either in your firm or people outside of the firm who you think might be good candidates, start having those conversations with them, right? Just floating the idea, um, and and see what bubbles to the surface. The conversation might not be with individuals, it might be with other firms about acquiring your practice if that's an option. But no, I would say it's never too late. What I have found is that the kind of knee-jerk reaction of worrying about what's going to happen and calling an employment agency to try to find somebody, that usually is counterproductive. Yeah.
Counterproductive.
Yeah. I mean, every once in a while it can work out, but it seems to me that that's kind of a last, a least good alternative. Um, and I think, a related issue that ties in with all of this is the whole process of having conversations with your high potential lawyers within your firm or that outside of your firm sooner rather than later about the pathways that you might see for them in terms of moving into your practice or your firm or whatever. And it's never too late to have those kinds of conversations, in my experience.
I mean, I'm sure that you must have come across instances where, sadly, lawyers have died very suddenly,
Mm,
and the unexpected comes along, and suddenly there's a major hole left in a
yeah.
firm. So presumably, having a good plan in place helps to preempt that
Yes.
scenario as well.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And then I find in those situations, I've seen this happen in several firms, the old adage of nature abhorring a vacuum, particularly when it has to do with a good, solid client base. That interestingly, in those situations, sometimes options appear
Yes,
that are kind of unexpected. And then it is incumbent on the practitioner or the firm to be really alert to those
yes,
and to
yes.
begin to proactively explore those options.
Can I just take this conversation very specifically to say the
Mm,
role of a managing partner, which you served as in Vermont?
mm,
So, apart from just someone reaching retirement age, there's also the issue of, I guess, succession if you've been in a leadership role in a firm like that and you choosing to stand down either by virtue of the fact that your tenure is up or
Mm,
you have reached a
mm,
retirement age. Do
mm.
you have any views about the choice of successor when you are a managing partner? How important is it
Yeah,
to find
yeah.
someone who is like you, or is it okay to have someone who's got a different personality profile?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to try to identify the individual whose capabilities and interests are most well aligned with what it is that the firm needs at the time. And one of the approaches that we always used in our firm is that we had a 3-person management committee. And that was with a 2-year term on the management committee. So it was a wonderful sort of training ground for our next level of leadership. And we were fortunate that it always seemed that, whatever it was that we needed for the firm at that point in time, we had someone who was ready, willing, and able to do that.
Can I ask you, do you think that in terms of retiring, is there a preferred retirement age? You think that senior partners should consider stepping down? I mean, I've worked with one who was in his late 70s just a couple of years
Yeah.
ago and had no
Mm.
intention of stopping.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe change the paradigm a little bit and suggest another word that starts with the letter R instead of retirement. And that word is reinvention of self. So from my point of view, when I left the practice of law, I wasn't retiring from anything, but I was reinventing myself. And what I have found is that the lawyers who bring that point of view to the process thrive.
Yeah.
But going back to your question, is there an optimal time? I would say no. I mean, for me, the optimal time was when I began to feel a little restless and that I had accomplished the majority, if not all, of what I wanted to accomplish in the context of practicing law. But yeah, like you, I've seen people who are adding enormous value well into their 70s, and others who really by the age of 50 should be hanging up
Yes.
their shield. One of my philosophies around timing of leaving a law practice is it's the old Barnum and Bailey adage of leave them wanting more,
Yeah.
leave them wanting more. Yeah.
And therefore, while there might not be an optimum age, do you think it's still important for a firm with, say, several partners to articulate
Mhm.
a preferred or as a policy a
Absolutely.
retirement age so everyone
Absolutely.
knows where they stand? Yeah.
Yep. And I would be inclined to make it sooner rather than later, like maybe 60 instead of 65, with the opportunity on a case by case basis to make it later. Because that way, if you have someone in the firm who really is kind of should be moving on, but is reluctant to do so, that you can precipitate a discussion about that without it being personal to that individual.
Yes. And
And conversely, you can extend if that's appropriate to do.
if you were a solo practitioner, and I raise this because I received a call just a few weeks ago from a solo practitioner who said, I've left it late
Yeah.
and I'm unable to sell my business. It seems to
Mm.
me the only option I might have is to put my shingle out, and hopefully a larger firm might come along and absorb me as a consultant. Do you think that's a worthwhile strategic approach for?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And I've seen solo practitioners and actually small firms do that quite well. And it can often align nicely with a larger firm wanting to kind of build up certain practice areas or have an office in a geographical location that they have not historically had. So I'm seeing a lot of that kind of activity, as I suspect you are as well. Yeah.
absolutely.
Mm.
And in terms of this sort of you when we were discussing this topic just a few weeks ago, you used a phrase which I rather like, the intergenerational tsunami. And obviously, demographically, we're seeing a lot of people
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
are in their 50s and 60s who've been working in the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
Do you think that with the increase and uptake of digitization, impacting on the delivery of legal services. This might accelerate retirement. Some people saying this isn't the
Yeah.
profession that I joined and I'm not enjoying it
Yeah.
anymore.
Yes, I would totally agree with that. And in the background is AI,
Yeah.
which is creating a lot of concern. Yes, and a lot of older practitioners have said to me, "Look, I don't enjoy this the
Yes.
way I used to," and that more is being required to be economically viable. The whole way of practicing is changing
Yeah,
for
very much
sure.
so. Very much
Yeah.
so. Do you detect there's a degree of when I say resistance, perhaps burying one's head in the sand about the impact of technology and how it's going to change
Yeah.
the culture of a law firm, particularly amongst the older generation?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there is a lot of resistance and denial around that. And that can make it very challenging for a firm administrator or a CEO or a general manager. Um, and in some cases, what I've seen is that practitioners who would have maybe stayed around in the practice longer, when the firm has puts in place new policies about the use of technology, that it's at that point that people will decide they've kind of had enough, or they'll go on their own and practice in more of the way that they're used to practicing.
Yeah, very
Yeah,
much so. And I know that
yeah.
you
It's raising the anxiety level, is what I would say for people.
so putting a bit of heat on and stimulating
Yeah,
these discussions
yeah.
from your experience of getting involved in partnership retreats. There's obviously only so much one can achieve if a day or a day and a half might be set aside. Do you recommend firms try and have these discussions? 80% of success is in the preparation beforehand. Do you kind of,
Uh-huh.
facilitate these discussions or encourage firms and general managers to actually try and get some of the way and some agreement or heads of agreement before they actually end up at a retreat somewhere in
Mm.
offsite?
Yeah, well, certainly you're absolutely right. I always think that planning a retreat is kind of like painting a room. That in fact 80% is in the preparation. And yeah, often I find as the third party facilitator, I can have sidebar, and I do have sidebar interviews with everyone, and I raise that as an issue. Again, the antidote to the anxiety and denial tends to be normalizing the discussion.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and talking about that is a major part of it. Yeah.
You kindly came on a workshop that I facilitated a few weeks ago for emerging leaders. And in this case, it was senior associates with an eye on potential directorship,
Yeah.
ownership, partnership. And there were some discussions, and you kindly shared with the attendees on that workshop your perspectives and gave them some, I think, very valuable advice in terms of going forward. But from the context of succession planning, it may be that there are young lawyers in their 30s who don't fully
Mm.
understand what they're letting themselves in for, and perhaps don't
Mhm.
fully appreciate what succession is all about, i.e., business continuity. So, for any senior associates or senior solicitors who might be tuning into this discussion, have you got any words of advice for them in terms of how to, talk to perhaps some senior lawyers about the future of the business? Because my
Yeah.
perception is a lot of them feel it's not my place to do so because I'm not an
Yeah.
owner, even though I might be in the frame to being a partner or a director one day.
They might kind of begin to feel it's a little intrusive and
Correct.
presumptuous to ask those questions. Yeah. Well, what I often will recommend when I'm doing one-on-one coaching with a high potential senior lawyer in a firm who's interested in moving into directorship or partnership is I will say, look, in your next, perhaps at your next appraisal or in a one-on-one conversation with, the managing partner or the general manager or whatever, I would start asking some open-ended questions about what is the process and begin to sort of talk about the business of the business and to express an interest in learning about the business of the business, not to necessarily see, the books and all of the financial information, but just to say, I want to learn about this because, they didn't teach me in law school. And I'm not learning it just in the practice itself. So broach the issue. And in most cases, I think as a high potential senior lawyer in a firm, you will find that leadership is quite open to that conversation and will welcome your interest.
Yes. And
Yeah.
do you think I'm aware that there are some general managers who are tuning into this discussion today, and they might also feel that because they're not owners of the business, that perhaps it's awkward for them to instigate the conversation. Is it worthwhile for them to refer people to you to sort of say, look, go and have a chat with Emily because she's been a managing partner. She's had a very successful succession plan that's repeated itself, into another generation. So in other words, having an offsider like you to share their anxiety or their fears with.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right that there is a role for a catalyst in this kind of situation, because without some kind of catalyst force, the status quo will prevail. So very often I might be the one that starts asking the questions, or might be encouraging somebody to ask those questions and be a bit of be kind of a liaison between management, leadership, and the next generation. That can work quite effectively. Certainly.
Because what I neglected to mention in my introduction of you is that you're actually also doing a master's in coaching at the moment. Is that correct?
Well, I'm actually doing a master's in counseling at the University of Auckland.
Yes.
And the reason for that, and it ties in with your question, is that I am finding increasingly that there's sort of this gray area between what I think of as professional development and then supporting people's individual and personal development. And there's an increasing level of anxiety and stress and depression and so forth among lawyers. And it manifests in a lot of behaviors around things like, what is your future? How are you going to pursue that? How are you going to be assertive? How are you going to, manage yourself in the context of the firm?
Yes.
And I'm finding that overlay of the counseling skills and the knowledge of how a professional practice operates can be very effective in being a catalyst for what could be considered a difficult conversation.
Absolutely.
And
one of the things I really enjoyed that you shared today is forget the retirement word and use the other R word, reinvention. You reinvented yourself. You reinvented yourself and moved away from doing, pure law to, counseling now and consulting. And presumably, it's always occurred to me that, the wisdom that people in their mid-60s have, that they can use that in a fresh way as an ambassador for the firm or to coach internally. And there must be a huge opportunity to just keep your finger in and keep busy.
Yeah. I would just, I would say 2 words: embrace it.
Right.
Embrace it. Don't deny it.
Yeah.
Embrace it. It's full of joy
and full of opportunity by the sounds of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So knowing you as I have done, you're a very optimistic person, it strikes me. So my last question is probably a little bit redundant, but are you optimistic for the future of the legal services industry and those legal professionals that work in it, particularly the younger generation?
Yes. And I'll tell you why. Because in my world, change equals opportunity.
And you certainly created some big changes in your life too.
It's worked well.
Terrific. Hey, well, for anyone who wants to get hold of you, they've got certainly the LawX website, which is lawx.nz, but also you have your own website as well, which I think it's emilymorrow.com.
That's correct. Yeah.
Excellent. So if people want to have a chat with you about succession planning, that's the place to go to. Emily, our time is up. It's been a great pleasure having you on Law Chat this month. Thanks for coming on, and we look forward to catching up with you again soon. So all the viewers who are tuning in today, thanks for joining us, and I'll be back next month with a chat with Sam Bassett of Moore Markhams, our sponsors, who'll be giving us his insights into some of the financial shenanigans that are going on at the moment and how firms are basically performing in these economic times. So for now, it's goodbye from me, and it's goodbye from Emily. Thanks once again, and we'll see you next month.